Hello, marketers. This is the Funnel Lab, and welcome to Funnel Lab Fridays. I am your host, Eric Westerkamp, CEO of CaliberMind. And Funnel Lab Fridays is a weekly LinkedIn live session where we dive into use cases and challenges for data savvy marketers. Joining me today are Meredith Foulke, marketing intelligence consultant with Etumos, and Doug Bell, who runs marketing here at CaliberMind. Welcome, both of you. Today, Meredith, Doug, and I are going to be talking about sort of how to declutter funnel performance data, which is kind of near and dear to a lot of our hearts. Welcome, Meredith. Maybe you could tell us just a little bit about kind of your role at Etumos, your background in marketing, and we'll kind of kick things off there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks for having me. I'm super excited to be talking with you guys. So my background has always been in marketing operations. I'm incredibly lucky that after school I kind of fell into this world and it was exactly what I wanted, and then worked my way into more of the analytics side of the house. And the reason that I started that I took the job with being a marketing intelligence consultant is that I felt like a lot of companies just weren't getting the value out of their data, and there's so many platforms out there that have so much to offer. And along the same line of this conversation is that it's very hard to figure out what's meaningful in the data and how to actually get the data points that you want that are impactful. So in my current role, I'm supporting companies getting multi-touch attribution platforms up. I work with data visualization so that you can have those key questions answered, and also supporting clients on just having those discussions with the executive team about what their data is, and making sure that what the work that the marketing team is doing is getting the recognition that it deserves.
Great, thanks. Doug, kind of quickly over to you. Quick question. What does it look like when performance marketing is kind of chock full of, I'll call it like these useless or this misleading funnel and performance data?
Yeah, we were sort of batting around different terms,
Mhm.
vanity metrics versus garbage metrics, when we were talking about what this looks like. There's a couple things I want to say. The first is that we are ultimately talking about a single funnel, but quite often you really are talking about, if you will, funnels that are controlled by different organizations. So this is the sales versus the marketing funnel that's happening. And I feel like what ends up happening is you get a lot less sort of these vanity and garbage metrics in the sales funnel. And so that's not a shot across the bow of my fellow marketers, but I think what you experience when you're getting this very cluttered funnel is, as an executive, you're getting a lot of data without a really good understanding of how that data is interrelated. In other words, if I do this thing, it's going to result in this other thing. And it's a term you and I use a lot, Eric. We call it elasticity, and to some degree, a little predictability. And so you know what it's like. You've sat in front of a whole spreadsheet full of data coming from a marketing organization, and you're not sure what to pay attention to.
Meredith, in your experience, kind of like, does this sound familiar to you? And what have you seen sort of at different organizations, on the spectrum of, hey, they're hyper focused on these sort of high level vanity metrics versus they've got things really well instrumented and they kind of know what they really need to be looking at, but maybe they're trying to tune it.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that. I think Doug kind of hit the nail on the head, is that there is a lot of data out there and it can be very overwhelming. And I think that a lot of organizations tend to get stuck in one part of the funnel, like we want to drive MQLs or we want to drive pipeline. And there's so much more than just those two components.
Yeah.
And every channel and every program that's being worked on and developed and pushing out to market has a different purpose and a different initiative. And a lot of times I hear people come in and they say, we just want to know what's driving the best MQL. The best MQL could mean a variety of things. Is that what channel is driving the best conversion to an MQL? Is that just driving the highest MQL? Or are you looking at the MQL that results in the most pipeline generation? And all of those have different meanings and need to be explored in different ways. And Doug talked about that relationship. This is where you need someone on the team who's well versed in the data, because It's more than just we drove an MQL. Why did that MQL happen? What happened after that MQL? And being able to speak to the story. And that's what helps then teams get the seat at the table with the executive and helping tell the story in a way that's impactful versus here's the number of MQLs that we got.
Yeah. Something we've seen a lot, and I'd be interested in your what you're seeing out there in the market, is that we have a lot of customers come to us and say, hey, we want to implement a funnel. We want to put a funnel in place. It's got more metrics and more things about it. Then you implement something. Then they stand back and they go, yeah, but those numbers don't match my numbers. Okay, well, you dig into that and you realize that a lot of time their numbers are tied to these vanity metrics. I got X this, I got this, and they're driving like how funnel stages. But then at the end, they turn around and ask you a question like, but I want to understand the whole buyer journey. How do you see companies trying to reconcile, like to understand a buyer journey, you've got to take all these metrics and, to be honest, collapse them into one journey, which then when you have one journey, you've got one thing moving through a funnel versus maybe 20 or 30 things, right? But then you can see the status of that journey over time versus a lot, I've got 50 MQLs. So how many fell out? Well, 48 of them. So 2 went on. Okay, was that meaningful metrics? Like, what do you see out there in the market, and how do you kind of reconcile that with customers?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Especially when it comes to the rise of attribution reporting, regardless of what platform is being used. Whether you're just looking at anonymous data and conversion to a known person. I think that people, there's a balance between showing one single journey and all of the data at the same point. And so what I tend to do and start out with clients is starting at each individual point of the journey and looking at those individually and asking them, what was the purpose of these programs that are performing well? Does that align with that part of the journey? If not, then we shouldn't be looking at those programs in that journey because that's not where you were driving to. So while your program may have been doing well at a certain part of the journey, was that the purpose of it? No, let's go back and figure out why. Of the ones who then did well at that part of the journey, what did they do next? And then build it down. So I like to start with a big picture and then break it down for specific groups of people or specific channels or specific ABM accounts to show similarities between the two of them.
Yeah. Doug, what have you seen? You've had a lot of experience with the companies kind of making the transition, from, for instance, a lead-based funnel to an ABM funnel, trying to run both funnels at the same time. The challenges they have, again, blending these, really, I call them, they're metrics, but they're really indicating some just level of engagement. Somebody did something and they're tying that engagement number to a funnel stage when maybe they really shouldn't be that closely tied together. What have you seen out there?
Gosh, let's fully admit that we're still stuck in a lead-based marketing funnel world that has an underlying assumption that a single person is driving an enterprise purchase. That's just not the case. And this is something I see happening a lot, which is you have buying units and buying committees, yet so an example, Eric, to your question rather, of vanity metrics are if you have an ACV, I'm going to say above, say 20 or 30K, you're likely be dealing with buying committees, buying units. And so, if you are paying attention to leads, then, I don't want to say all hope is lost, but you're going to get a lot of those cluttering metrics across your funnel. Whereas if you're more focused on account level funnels, you're going to get better data. The other thing, and you've sort of pulled on this thread, so I'm going to keep pulling on it, Eric, is this idea that funnels, even in their aggregate, are great predictors of outcomes. And to some degree, I think you can find a heuristic and you can sort of hack through it. But really, at the end of the day, it's an engagement world. And those buyer journeys, we at CaliberMind, if you have not gotten a sales presentation, by the way, check it out. It's great stuff. But like one of the slides we always present is, here's what the executives think of the buyer journey. And it's a straight line, right? And then below it is, this almost like cartoonish level of activity for a buyer journey. And that's the reality, is there's this complexity. And so then if we take that over, what we start realizing is that especially for a account-based funnel, you still have all this complexity. You have more clarity because your core metric is better. But what are you trying to do at each stage of the funnel? And that's where people, I think, get lost, is they sort of misunderstand what's happening at various stages and how to measure that.
Yeah, one thing we've seen is that, funnels can be very contentious because they are used for multiple different things. Marketing is trying to use a funnel for understanding where to apply more time, more effort, what programs to run. But management is kind of looking at it as a measurement of performance and how well the team is doing at certain jobs, right? And so they seem to be kind of mixing metrics together. And so you get this kind of, this pull on these single metrics, which is like, this team is using me to measure X, so I want that number to be bigger. But I'm also trying to use that number to tell me what I really need to be doing. So I need to have a good view. It needs to be accurate. And those things kind of pull at each other, right? And we see that a lot. How do you guys bridge that with some of the companies that you guys have worked with?
Yeah, I think that's a hard question because obviously marketing has a job to commit to and to do, and so there is an expectation to maintain that. But I think that it comes down to if you can back up why you made changes or why program, and be able to talk to that relationship between how it's performing and what the expectation was, or the difference between one team that needs to get a particular metric or a particular point in the funnel, and you can say that this is the relationship between these programs that I'm maintaining and working off of, and this is why these points of data happened, and speak to that story. I think then you can have a better discussion around merging the conversation between performance of how the team is supposed to do and hitting those goals. But it does start with being clear and transparent and open about those expectations at the beginning. And I think that that's one thing that when I'm helping clients with some of these conversations with executives, it's going back to fundamentals, getting the benchmarks in place, talking to expectations at the start versus talking about the data after it's happened. And I think having that conversation sooner rather than later between these vanity metrics and points of the funnel is really important.
Something we've seen starting to take root in the market is a way of blending these two together is that you need to be able to take these metrics and use them as an indicator of something, but not necessarily use the quantity as the specific, like, hey, I've got 500 of these, therefore I've got, 800, X leads, right?
Exactly.
And measure the impact they're having, and then use that impact as a way of having a journey move down a funnel, right? That's why we're becoming, be honest, more and more proponents of using engagement as a way of measuring where a company really is, and then tying value, like all these different marketing things that can happen to raise engagement. And then when a company gets to a certain level of engagement, you move it right down the funnel, right? Because that way we're finding that that's a much better indication of blending together all the different marketing things that happen, all the different interactions. But then when the right people get to the right level of engagement, now they're ready to be an MQL. Becoming an MQL may be coming from because they filled out a demo form or they did this, but it could also be because of all these other interactions that have just kind of raised them to a certain level, right? Are you seeing that are you seeing that model start to take root in the industry, or is that still kind of a nascent concept?
I think that it's starting to take place, but I think a lot of that is because teams are starting to put the value in having support from a BI team or from a revenue operations team, or having an analyst on their team that's supposed to support that, because I think that's one of the hardest things, is that there's not that support there, and a lot of people are going out and buying all these platforms to do the job, but still not understanding how a metric is actually determining impact or related to an impact. And I like the way that you said that, is that that requires that extra step. And I think platforms like CaliberMind are doing that, where it provides that time back to the user and putting that very clearly of here's the metrics that you got, here's these engagements that you got, but here's actually the impact that it happened. And did that impact align with its purpose? Did the engagement align with its purpose as well? So I think we're not there where I can say, oh, I go into all of my clients and they're all on that page. No, I don't think there, but I think we're starting to get there because
starting to see people moving on.
Yeah.
Doug, something we've talked a lot about is sort of that, you know, a funnel can often, it's often being used by two different, you know, core groups in the organization, marketing and sales. And the challenge is that when you take a marketing funnel and a sales funnel, the sales funnels tend to be very deterministic. I mean, it starts, an op is created, there's a value, and you kind of track from that op down, right? It tends to be tied to one or a couple of ops to an account, right? And then you've got your marketing funnel, which starts up here with like just general, I'm getting some level of engagement. Usually you get to like, okay, now I'm creating an MQL. And the challenge I've seen is that, okay, but marketing is really lead based, right? But then when it gets translates into sales, that's really account based or opportunity based. And suddenly you have to collapse all this stuff from here to here. And that's where I see a lot of the friction happen in organizations. It's in that collapsing, because marketing is like, well, you can't take my 20 and turn it into 2 because it was 20. Well, but sales is like, yeah, but there's only one op. How do you see organizations kind of bridging over that gap and creating a funnel they can use that can measure performance across it? Because at the end of the day, you need to know what activities up here drove to here, and then what marketing activities were happening while sales was engaged that are helping drive things down. So you need that to be blended together.
Yeah, I mean, you sort of answered the question with your earlier statement to in question to Meredith, which is, you know, the answer for me is transitioning over to engagement-based measures of, and this is especially true for anybody selling into business units, or sorry, to business units rather. I think that's a big piece of it. I think maybe the way to think about this is, I'm going to use a bad analogy, but you guys remember Pinko machines? I'm in the Bay Area, so there's just a lot of sort of these interesting places where you can just go and play Pinko. I'm sure they've got a name, and it's a ball, and it just kind of goes all the way down, and you're gambling somehow, right?
Yeah.
I think that's how marketing looks at their funnel, right? It's like you're putting balls in, and if I put enough balls in, I'm going to get to the bottom. To Eric's point, I'm going to get 2 ops out of it. Whereas the sales organizations understand sort of like I have a skill set that I can apply to make it likely that things are moving through, but really it's on us at the end of the day. And so I mentioned that simply because when it's happening is marketing sees it as a volume game. If I just jam more stuff in, and sales sees it as a quality game. But the common thread between the two, or process, the common thread between the two is, in each case, each of your stages has a purpose in the overall. And what you're not trying to do is to say, I've got a Pinko machine. What you're trying to say is, how do I create engagement such that a buyer is more likely to have higher engagement? Who cares? Like, these are all internalities, MQL, SQL, like no one cares. And so I think it's hard to report on. Eric, you and I have done this. You mentioned ABM. We're still sort of figuring out what our ABM reporting structure looks like a year in, right? Because you're just brain snaps on the Pinko machine.
Yeah. Before we jump into kind of tool time, Meredith, any thoughts that you've seen on sort of that whole transition from marketing to sales and the funnel and how they're managing that friction?
Yeah, this is actually very timely because I was having a conversation with some folks about, the CRMs. They look at, once you're a contact, you're a part of that account with those opportunities. You're not re-engaged, like you're not going through a person life cycle again because you've already gone through a person life cycle. So how do you have that conversation with that? And I think that it kind of goes back to, we just want to keep those folks re-engaged and see how they're still contributing to opportunities, see who those folks are that are continuing to re-engage, are supporting sales and to getting those opportunities. But it doesn't mean that marketing is not involved anymore. they've already been qualified, they've already made it through, and there was a reason to open up an opportunity, there was a reason to do so. So it transitions from how do you make them qualified to more of a conversation, as Doug pointed out, how do you keep them engaged?
Yeah.
And so I think that's where the transition is. We don't want to keep requalifying them because they've already done that. They've already gone through their person life cycle. Now we transition and have to make the transition to how do we keep that account engaged, but there's still contacts on that account. Even though sales looks at it as slimmed down, each of those are people and points of contact. So we just need to transition away from getting them qualified to keeping them re-engaged.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that's a good segue. I'm going to share a little bit of how we look at this. And Doug, can you guys see my screen? So make sure I'm showing the right thing.
Yep.
One of the big things that we talked about here that I thought was really interesting was, at the end of the day, what am I trying to use my funnel for? Right? Sales really uses their part of the funnel to help them measure and to forecast.
Yep.
What am I going to do this quarter? How much am I going to close? What are my conversion rate? What reps have high? Like, they use it very deterministically. Marketing is using it for very different purposes. What should I be doing more of? What is getting people to move down the funnel? What activities, content, things like that are working versus are not working? How can I help sales, engage with more people and the right people and things like that? They're using it for very different things, right? So you need to be able to see it in different ways. And one of the things we talked about yesterday was, how could you, for instance, come in and measure, there's a very different, you can look at numbers in very different ways. Like here, we're looking at a stage analyzer for our MQL stage, right? Where I'm looking at our market MQA stage for us, because we do everything account-based, right? So here's our MQA stage, we're looking at campaign types. But what's interesting is I can come in here, and if you've set up a funnel in a way and you've focused your metrics in a way that you can have like a very good, this is a buyer journey, and that journey is moving through your funnel, and I may collapse a bunch of people and activities into that journey. You can then start to get decent metrics around, okay, what campaign types have the most effect at this stage, right? And it's not tied to the person, because that person may do 5 or 6 things, right, on that lead at different stages, right? That's the only way you can start to get some of that data. Like, something we were talking about yesterday is like the difference between here's different quarters. I'm looking at different campaign types. I may be looking at different metrics, right, in counts. But here I may be looking at counts of how many occurred at this stage, but the conversion rates might be low, right? But I may have other ones where very low counts and very high conversion rates. And because of the way the data works, you could have low numbers and high conversion rates. So if you're only looking at conversion rates, you may be looking at the wrong thing, right? But if I'm only looking at the raw numbers, I also may be looking at the wrong thing, right? But by changing stages, you can also see how these different campaigns and types actually measure what's being effective at different locations in your funnel, right? Something that I thought was interesting as I switched this over to industry to kind of highlight this. And when I was looking at this, I was saying, okay, if I look at, I don't know, Q4 of last year, let's go to that. And I look at my counts, I could see that like I have really high counts for industry and professional services and things like that, right? But this one here, lower count, has a much higher conversion rate than internet. And then down here, I have conversion rates that are 100%, but I've got one of them in these fields, right? Doug, maybe you could talk through, like, you use this stuff kind of all the time to help us with our performance marketing. How is it that you're using this data directly to kind of help you essentially increase the effectiveness of the performance marketing campaigns that we're doing?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and yes, I'm in it all the time. And so to sort of get us anchored back in this idea of how do we look at the right metrics at the right stages, I would say this, 2 things. The first is, again, back to the Plinko model, right? We have to think about this in terms of what it is we want from each stage for that ball to make it through and us to win money magically somehow, right? And so the way to think about this, and I'll give you an example for CaliberMind, there are channels whose sole purpose is to create engagement
Mhm.
at the top, at the quote unquote top of the funnel. I'm doing that very intentionally
Yeah.
because what's happening is if we can get people onto our website, just get them onto the website and we create a little bit of engagement, we know exactly what to do to really help them make it to the next stage. Is that a funnel stage? No, I actually would argue that's engagement level, right?
Yeah.
But
Right.
our best look into that is going to be the quote unquote next stage down, right? So as an example, with inbound, I'm going to say my most important metric is the gross volume and the cost per engagement at the top. But as I
Right.
get down a little bit further, I'm actually worried about how those channels are increasing engagement. But in the funnel, that's going to look like conversions.
Right. It's like you can see that here, like we're looking at an MQA down, moving to the next stage. You're seeing that paid search and paid social are having very little impact there, right? But if I were to move to the top of our funnel, just essentially that is bound, in theory, we should see a much higher level of that kind of hitting, right? And you do. I mean, you can see here how much more impactful paid search and the numbers and the quantities are up here at the top of the funnel,
Because
right?
that's the role it's performing,
That's the role it's
right?
performing, right?
Yes.
But if we were measuring strictly how many numbers what's the count at the very top? Well, we may be getting a very, we may be getting a view that isn't helping us much, right? Because what we want to know is like, I've got, I had a lot here. We were doing a lot of paid social kind of, at the beginning of last year, but the conversion rates were meh, right? And now I'm seeing these conversion rates get better. And then as you move toward the current, of course, this current quarter, there's not gonna be a lot here. These numbers will come up over time as, to be honest, as people get more engaged and we de-anonymize the accounts and things like that, we actually see those numbers start to come up over time. But you can start to see the conversion rates at these levels in the funnel.
Yeah, and I think one point to add there too, again, just highlighting that having the understanding of your data is that there is a relationship between the counts and the conversion rates as well. So that while you can look at them two separately, there's also an idea of normalizing that data so that you can give it a score and see, okay, what has a good count and a conversion rate? What is considered normal? And also having your benchmark in there to say, wow, we got 1,500 from paid search. That's a great count for this month, but what are you doing over time? How does that actually compare over time for that? And what is your conversion rate? Because if your conversion rate's low, but you had a high count for that, that's a different story. So
Yeah, right. And then you want to drill that in, maybe go into your ROI, because with paid search and things like that, you want to go look at your ROI reports to say like, well, what was my actual ROI and what I spent up here, right? But as you go down funnel, the ROI is a little bit harder to really measure because a lot of the
exactly.
activities are less directly tied to discrete expense.
Mm-hmm.
They're
Yep.
not ads, they're webinars, they're events, they're marketing and sales outreach. There's a whole spectrum of things that are going on, right? That ROI gets harder and harder because the dollars move, to be honest, from ads toward activities that are happening from marketing and sales teams.
Yeah, exactly. And having a discussion about that and having those clear definitions is going to be and also ensuring that everyone's reporting on costs the same way. Because as you pointed out, there's a very different way to report on ROI depending on the granularity and what
Yep,
team is on what. So
that's absolutely true. And the last thing that I'll kind of cover is that one of the things that we found very useful is the ability to kind of stay out here and look at this stuff from sort of a really super high level, right? What's going on in trends, but then being able to go all the way down and say, okay, but here's an account or two or three that are actually working very, very well, right? And being able to drill down to, who knows here? Let's go to an account and look directly at their entire funnel, right? So what did this account, so here's an account that really worked. What did they do? Where did they go? How did they engage with us, right? And being able to then say, okay, what campaign types did they engage with? What did they do? Like who was engaged at what stages and all of that. It's the combination of being able to look at that level plus the high level metrics that we found is very powerful. But you can only do this if you're aggregating, right? That
yep.
gets back to that first point we had that like, if I'm just looking at, I've got the stage and I got all these MQLs, awesome. I had 100 MQLs, but I'm not collapsing those down to the account level. I can't really get a good view of the buyer journey because the buyer journey incorporates lots of people and lots of events at different stages, and you need to be able to see them all pulled together, right?
And
But that
that's
does cause the issue that we've seen with companies that are like, well, how come my MQA stage is, 1/3 of what my numbers used to be? Well, those numbers are still here. They've been collapsed together because the reality was you may have had 15 MQLs that really are one journey moving through your system. And I could count it as 15, but what does that do for you? But if I collapse them, I can now show you how it's all working together.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so it's definitely finding the balance between both of those, and collapsing and then finding the trends and how can you expand that out to other accounts.
Yep. Doug, any last thoughts or comments on this before we wrap up?
Yeah, a ton of good advice from Meredith. Thanks for being on the show with us today. I always want to try and leave folks with some action items here. So if you're showing up on this LinkedIn live event, talking to us about decluttering the funnel, if you will, you're sort of looking for hacks. Let me give you a couple if I can, Eric. The first is, you've got a lot of data likely, so just look for your best efficiency metric. My favorite to start with is closed won deals, and then start working my way from top of funnel down to see over time what's the greatest efficiency. In other words, and you just nailed it, Meredith or Eric, this idea of like having multiple contexts flowing through that are actually a part of the same account. But that's the way to sort of think about it. What's my most likely level of efficiency? It's the first thing, and then just one metric per funnel stage.
Yeah.
One metric, right? And quite often, as you get in the middle of the funnel, those are converting metrics.
Yep.
The thing mentioned, by the way, is sometimes you have friction metrics as well. I've seen folks who have an overwhelming volume of people requesting demos or trials. And in some cases, you want to create friction. So just please pay attention to what your sales process is, what the buyer's journey is, look for those efficiency metrics, and then start with one metric per funnel stage and just stick with that.
Yep. I would push it. That's an engagement metric.
I would agree.
And then you could roll all these other things into it and just measure how important you think those things are. Yep. Meredith, thanks so much for joining us today. Doug, as always, it was great talking with you. So that wraps up this episode of Funnel Lab Fridays. I believe we're off next week. We'll be back on Friday the 9th. Is that correct? Next week is
Friday the 16th.
Friday the 16th. Yep. And if you've missed an episode and you want to use next Friday to catch up, you can find the past number of episodes all on Funnel Lab on YouTube. Thanks so much.
Thank you all.